Thank you for attending our webinar session on Are My IoT Deployments Secure? You will be sent a link of today's recorded session to the email address you provided. Please use the Q&A window for any technical issues or content questions. We'll address any technical issues right away, and we'll answer as many of the content questions as we can during the presentation and at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. As a reminder, you can type your question in the Q&A window at any time during the webinar, as we do have a team of SMEs, or subject matter experts, available to respond. Before we get started today, our team has asked that we ask you a few poll questions. The first poll question: when you are developing and deploying your IoT infrastructure, what is your main concern? Can you progress the slide, please? Okay, when you are developing and deploying your IoT infrastructure, what is your main concern? So on this next slide here, if you could please click on one of these: security, privacy, reliability, or safety. So when you are developing and deploying your IoT infrastructure, what is your main concern? Security, privacy, reliability, safety. And please click Submit when you're done. Thank you very much. And we'll take a look at the results. There we go. The next poll question: which part of IoT security is the most important to you? Which part of IoT security is the most important to you? Device security, which is hardware, OS, and application on the IoT device. Connection security, protocols, encryption, etc. Cloud security, processing and storage of your data. Or perhaps you're not sure. I'll give you a couple of moments to respond there, and please click Submit when you're done. And there's the responses there. Thank you very much. Third poll question: on a scale of 1 to 5, how concerned are you about IoT hacks? One being not at all concerned, 2 being reasonably concerned, 3 somewhat concerned, 4 pretty concerned, or 5 extremely concerned. If you could click on one of those, please, and hit Submit when you're done. Thank you very much. And there are the responses. Okay, now we have a final poll question coming up. Have you ever considered Microsoft as a trusted IoT security partner? Have you ever considered Microsoft as a trusted IoT security partner? Yes, no, or maybe you haven't given it much thought. Please go ahead and hit Submit, and we'll take a look at the responses there. Very good. Thank you very much. Now it's time to introduce our presenters for today. We're very excited to have with us Leandro do Carmo Awase and Ajman Samuel. Please take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you for the introductions. I'm Ajman Samuel. I lead security on the Azure IoT engineering team. And together with Leandro, we're going to talk about the rise of IoT. We're going to talk how IoT is transforming businesses today. We're also going to talk about some of the threats that IoT brings to the table once you're starting to deploy your IoT infrastructure. But then we'll also have a little bit about the evaluation that you'll need to do for your IoT infrastructure. And finally, we'll talk about who can do that evaluation. The people who are part of the security program can help you with that. And towards the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers. And now I'll hand over to Leandro to talk about the transformation that IoT is bringing in.
Great.
Leandro.
Yeah, thank you, Arjama. So my name is Leandro. I work in the AzureIoT marketing side. And now let's talk then about the rise of IoT, why it's so important, it's become such a trend topic. The first thing, according to IDC, we're going to have 30 billion devices connected to the cloud via the internet by 2020. Just to give an idea how much data is going to be flowing to the cloud, we are talking about 44 zettabytes of data. What does it mean? Just for context, 1 zettabyte is equal to 1 billion gigabytes. That's just a lot of data. And obviously, we will need intelligence in order to process all the data with analytics and be able to come up with new services and solutions. So what is that data or that intelligence is going to be able to provide to companies and customers? It's basically going to promote the digital transformation, which should come up and create new revenue streams and new income streams. So that's why Internet of Things is becoming very, very popular nowadays. So just to give an example of some of the customers that we have been working with, and they were able to connect millions of their devices into the Microsoft Cloud. For example, we have Rockwell Automation, which what we are doing is basically helping them monitor the oil pipelines that they have in the United States in order to optimize their operations and reduce their costs. Another very interesting example is about ThyssenKrupp. ThyssenKrupp is an elevator company, and with the IoT, they were able to transform their business. Previously, they're only selling the elevators, and they actually call them cars to companies, right, and to buildings and so on. But nowadays, they transform the business, and they're providing services. So with IoT, they're able to ingest data from those elevators, understand exactly what's the behavior, and predict with analytics when there's going to be a failure. With that, they can take predictive maintenance actions, and the service that they're actually selling to customers right now is the maintenance of those elevators. So they're not selling elevators anymore, but actually selling services. We also have Rolls-Royce, which is also another very interesting case. In this case, we are helping monitor the engine of airplanes to be able to save costs by increasing efficiency and saving fuel. We also have Johnson Controls. We're actually monitoring chillers in a lot of their buildings and locations in the United States for more like a smart building scenario. So IoT is actually transforming the business of a lot of companies that Microsoft is working on, specifically focused on the B2B and enterprise and industrial scenarios, as I just mentioned a couple examples for you guys. But then IoT actually brings a couple interesting risks, poses some interesting challenges. Just to give some examples, towards the end of 2016, you may remember, there was a hacker attack that affected the internet in several countries, including the United States and several countries in Europe. And a lot of big companies were actually affected by that attack. We're talking about Netflix, Airbnb, Twitter, just to mention some of those companies. And the attack actually started via IoT devices. The second example that we have here is about The Atlantic, which is actually a company, and they built a fake toaster, web toaster, just to check how long it would take for somebody to actually hack into that device. And it took within an hour for somebody to be able to do that. So it poses the risk that with a lot of devices being connected to the cloud, we actually need to take actions to make sure that those devices are secure. And then the last thing here is that according to Gartner, 25% of the identified attacks on the internet in the enterprise, they're going to probably involve IoT, and this is by 2020. So a lot of interesting challenges here, which give us a question. So how do you detect and manage IoT security risks? It's interesting because with IoT, you're talking about the convergence of two worlds. We have the digital world, which is represented by information technology, and also the physical world with OT or operation technology, which creates what we call the system of systems. That's why in IoT, it poses unique challenges by the combination of those two worlds. So from an IT perspective, so what is the mission for IT? It's basically to design, maintain software and hardware, and network resources to make sure they run securely and provide privacy. And then which are some of the examples or things that they do? For example, they use secure development lifecycle, known as SDL in the IT industry. They also leverage monitoring, alerting, for example, just to mention a few things from the IT side. But then on the other side, we have the OT or the physical world. What is their mission? It's basically to design and maintain machines which run reliably and safely. And how do they do that? Building robust machines with built-in safety features, and also, for example, to use automated monitoring and control. With that, now let me transition to Arjun, who is going to talk about how do we increase the security from an IoT perspective. Arjun?
Thank you, Leandro. So, as Leandro mentioned, IoT security is one of the big key things that we all like to think about, especially companies who are deploying IoT in their businesses and they're going through that transformation. For them to think about the security risk is important because these risks can result in some real damage to those companies. And we'll talk about some of the threats that are out there, but also we'd like to talk about the consequences of those threats. Because each of those threats can result in different kinds of consequences. And then finally, in order to detect those threats, we have a few evaluation strategies that we have worked on and we have proposed. And we would want you to understand what those evaluation strategies are. And then we would want you to also know how to pick the right evaluation strategy from amongst this larger list. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the security program, which allows you to find the right evaluator who can actually help you evaluate your IoT infrastructure using those strategies. So that's really our goal here, is to go from threats to consequences to evaluation strategies and then finally find the right person who can evaluate your IoT risks. Let's go and talk a little bit about threats. As we all know, IoT infrastructure, similar to IT infrastructure, has been under a lot of threats. But IoT infrastructure tends to be slightly different. Different because in addition to all the cyber threats that are out there, there are also threats to the physical infrastructure, the physical world. And those threats are important because that is the nature of IoT. And because of those physical threats, we need to think a little differently about IoT security and IoT risks. Listed here are some of the threats. We have a few more as well, but here is just a short list. For example, the abuse of IoT infrastructure is one big thing we should think about. Examples of those are man-in-the-middle attack, malware activity on IoT infrastructure, which can result not only in the IT infrastructure being misused and data, as an example, being compromised, but also your physical machines being compromised, which are connected into the IoT infrastructure. Hijacking is another one. What if your IoT devices are hijacked and then they are used to either do bad things to other IoT devices or generally launch an attack on the internet, which was the case a few months back. Then we have outages. Now these attacks tend to be physical attacks. What happens when there is a power outage in your power plant, in your operations, and now your IoT infrastructure is not available? So how do you deal with those kind of threats? As we all know, we live in a real world, in a natural world, so there are natural disasters which are out there. Floods is an example, earthquakes is another example. So what happens when these threats are out there, and what do you do, and how do you prepare for your IoT infrastructure for such threats? Failures and malfunctions, of course, can result from software failures in the infrastructure you're running, but also it could result from hardware failures in, let's say, the robotic arm that you're using. So you have to understand how those failures and malfunctions manifest themselves and how those threats can be detected and then mitigated. And then, of course, physical attacks. There is always a case of tampering. Now, this attack is even more important in IoT because now your physical sensors, your physical IoT devices might actually be deployed in the wild. It might be on the road. It might be in a pipeline which is going across the country. So you have to think about the physical security of those IoT assets and think about the physical attacks that can be launched against your IoT infrastructure. So these are some examples of the different kinds of threats that IoT infrastructure has today. And as you will notice that while explaining those, there are a bunch of threats which are physical in nature, which are over and above the IT threats. And so we don't want to underplay the threats from the IoT infrastructure, but also we want to be very careful to point out that there are physical attacks out there which you need to consider. So now let's go a little bit deeper and talk about some of the consequences of those threats. Each of those threats that I just mentioned and more, as we'll point you to a document which lists them, can result in different kinds of consequences to your business. There is consequences to your company, There are consequences to your customers. There are consequences to the infrastructure that you are running. So let's go over in what are the consequences to your businesses. Loss of control. You're running an IoT infrastructure with robotic arms. It could be a critical infrastructure, a power system, which now is out of control. You can't control it. So that is a real consequence of bad things happening on your IoT infrastructure. What about loss of data? That is very relevant to the IT domain. We have been dealing with the loss of data for quite some time. But with IoT data, you have much more richer kind of data that can be lost. Now, damage to your brand is a real risk which as a business you totally understand. You totally get that. Because if your business, the IoT infrastructure which is deployed in your business is compromised, is under attack, then your brand is also under attack. Your brand is compromised. So you'll need to think about that as well. And then of course, when you have all of these bad things happening, if they happen, then there is a real financial loss, both in terms of loss of productivity and perhaps loss of your assets, loss of future business. So all of those things result in a financial impact to your company. So when you think about the consequences that can come from all of those threats, here are some of the threats that can affect your company. To your customers, of course, when data is compromised, when machines are compromised, not just the privacy, which is actually compromised, but also their safety might be compromised. The service that you provide to them might not be available to them. So the customers are impacted in a real way here. And then finally, the infrastructure, because of environmental damage, might be not available to anybody. Similarly, loss of life is a real concern for when you're deploying an IoT infrastructure which involves physical devices and physical machines. So having thought about the threats as I previously described, and then thinking about the consequences of those threats takes you to a place where now you are thinking about, okay, my business in this is doing these kind of things, and these are the different threats that I need to think about. And those threats are not just threats in themselves, they have real consequences to the different things that I do. Now you might need to start thinking about the evaluation strategies. So how do I evaluate my IoT infrastructure for security? Now what we say here is that you cannot evaluate your IoT infrastructure in just one way. You have to look at it from different perspectives. You have to look at it from different angles. And then you have to put in those different security features, techniques, mitigations that would create these layered defense in depth. And as in security, we have been doing it for a number of years, is to put in as many different layers of defense as possible, so that if any one layer is compromised, you still have some functionality available. You can still recover from that attack. So defense in depth and the fact that you need to think of multiple evaluation strategies once you are looking for those strategies is important here. Okay, so now what we have here is some of the evaluation strategies that we have come up with. And these evaluation strategies are not just a list of strategies or not just a list of different things that you can do on your IoT infrastructure to detect the threats. These are to be applied at different stages of your project while you're working on the project. Now the graphic on the right here shows the different stages. So it starts with the design, goes into the development, and this development could be hardware oriented, it could also be software oriented, and we're putting them together. Then it goes into testing. You could be making a physical device, or you could be writing some software to run on that device or in the cloud. So testing of the hardware and the software is the third column here. Then we have deployment. You would actually get into deploying this infrastructure in your IoT wherever you want to deploy that. And then finally the operations, the long-term operation throughout the life cycle of your IoT infrastructure is here. Now if you notice over here, these rows in there talk about each of the different strategies at different times. As an example, the end-to-end threat modeling starts at the design phase. We would want you to start thinking about your threats really early on once you are thinking about the design of the infrastructure. And then when you are doing the development of the hardware and the software, you would want to go back to that threat model and look at what are the different threats that I am covering here. Similarly, if you're thinking about deploying, once imagine that you're done with your IoT infrastructure development, testing, you want to deploy it, you want to then start doing a deployment review before you deploy. And then moving down this list, we have what we call the authorization and access control review, which essentially looks at what kind of authorizations do different people who are on the infrastructure, who will be using the infrastructure, have. What kind of access do they have? What kind of, how do they come in and authenticate themselves? How do they come in and identify themselves? You would like to identify and evaluate that during the testing and the deployment phase. Going down the list, we have the device risk analysis. Now, this is an important piece of evaluation because IoT devices, because they are small, they are not very expensive, and they tend to be created in bulk. So, there are a lot of vulnerabilities which might be left on the device. There also might be some design issues on the device, and because it is so cheap, you don't want to invest too much time in looking at those design issues. Now, that is something that we would recommend avoiding. We would want you to look very closely at that device and then do a device risk analysis. And I'll give you an example here. If you have a device which naturally comes with a USB port, you need to ask yourself that question. Do I really need a USB port on a device which would be deployed out in the wild, perhaps in the mall or on the road, where anybody can bring a USB stick and inject some bad malware in it? So those are the kind of analyses that you need to do with your device. Then you need to also look at the device firmware. So you have a device with a firmware with maybe an operating system, but how do you deploy it? And what is the strategy to, let's say, update it? Because inevitably you are going to run into a situation where you will need to update that firmware. You will need a mechanism to go back and fix some bugs. So you'll need to think about that. Now, IoT infrastructure, of course, depends on a network. It could be an IP network, but it could also be specialized networks like SCADA and BACnet. And those networks need to be tested. You need to look at the protocols that you're using and appropriately test them. The technical word we use is fuzzing. So you like to do protocol fuzzing there. And usually this is done in the testing phase. And then, of course, after that, you will also like to do some network traffic analysis, which essentially could be when you're deploying your infrastructure, or it could be when you are operating it. Because IoT threats and IoT vulnerabilities would be detected by different malicious actors during the lifetime of IoT infrastructure. So constantly you need to have this analysis done on what all traffic is flowing on my infrastructure. Then let's talk a little bit about code review. While you have looked at all of the design and what kind of software is running and what kind of hardware I'm using, you also want to go and look at the code, the actual code, white box testing of that code, and look at that and see what kind of software I'm using. Now, this is very important, especially when you're using code which is not your own code that could be open source, and you're bringing that in. You have to be very careful in integrating that into your main project and using it so that it is secure. You would like to go in and do some encryption review, because every communication that is happening between the device and other devices or the cloud need to have secure channels established. When you establish these secure channels, you need to go back and look at what are the different kinds of keys that I'm using for encryption, as an example. You like to see what strength of encryption is required there. You also would like to justify what kind of strength of encryption is required in that specific scenario. Is it more secure encryption that you're going to use or not? So those are the kind of questions that you need to ask, and those questions are typically asked during the design, the development, and the testing phase. And then finally, the last column here is the privacy review. You would want to go in and see what all data you are collecting, how you are saving it, both on the device, and if you're using the cloud or any other storage system, how is it stored? Is it encrypted when it is at rest or not? If your backend systems are compromised or your channels from the device to the cloud are compromised, what kind of privacy leakage is going to happen? So you have to think about that. And finally, the last one is penetration testing. What happens is when we design these systems, both the software and the hardware systems, we tend to at times overlook some of the key vulnerabilities which might be in there. It's always wise to have a third party, somebody other than the development team and the testing team, come in and do a penetration testing of the infrastructure. They would use different tools, they would use different methodologies to go in and look for any vulnerabilities in your infrastructure and then tell you what you need to fix. So this really is kind of the evaluation strategies and when during the different phases of your project that you would like to use those strategies. Now the question then becomes, how do I evaluate, because many of the skills here might not be in-house to you. And these many skills that I've talked previously are very niche. For example, the network analysis is in itself a very specialized task and a specialized skill that very few people have. So what we have done, knowing that this is an issue and would always be an issue, what we have done, we have tried to find the right evaluators, we have tried to find the right auditors who have skills in all of these different areas. And we are also looking for these evaluators who work in different verticals. People who specialize in healthcare are very different from people who specialize in critical infrastructure analysis. So what we have done is we have started this new program called the Security Program for Azure IoT. Part of this program are a bunch of third-party evaluators and auditors who specialize in different parts of IoT infrastructure analysis. They have their own skills, they have their own tools that they bring to the table, and they are independent, they are third-party. What we do is we work with them as partners, and when you, our customers, would want yourselves to be evaluated, going back to the previous slide, at different stages of your project, we can actually link you up to these third-party evaluators, and these evaluators can help you find those vulnerabilities and help you understand what kind of evaluations you need to run and what kind of things, mitigations, are you going to do in your design and in your code so that your IoT infrastructure is more secure. So this security program is really a culmination of looking at the threats, finding the consequences of those threats and understanding what those are, finding and evaluating and selecting the right evaluation strategy, and then finally coming in and saying, here is a security program which allows me to find the right auditor. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand back to Leandro, who's going to talk a little bit about Azure IoT and how it adds value to what you're doing.
Thank you, Arjuman. The secure program for Azure IoT is really important to help customers evaluate their IoT infrastructure. Now, let's talk a little bit about the cloud platform from Microsoft and the IoT solution that we have for that. For the Microsoft AzureIoT Cloud, so from a platform perspective, Microsoft is one of the very few hyperscale cloud providers in the world, but we serve over 1 billion customers that are always storing their data into our cloud. And also, we have data centers covering over 127 countries. So really, really broad coverage from a platform perspective. From an intelligence perspective, we do have a lot of features and functionalities to really help secure your infrastructure, such as EMS, OMS, and also machine learning for advanced analytics, which really adds intelligence to the cloud. But then we also have the partners who are super important for our ecosystem. Arjuman mentioned about the secure program for Azure IoT, but in addition to that, we also work with companies and industry bodies and industry standards to really understand what is the latest thinking that the industry is going to make sure that Microsoft is part of that. So from the Microsoft AzureIoT, from the platform, intelligence, and from the partners, we do believe that the Microsoft Azure is the right cloud for you. But then if you talk a little bit more about IoT, so the solution that we have is called Azure IoT Suite. So what is it? It's basically a combination of the most important Azure services for IoT. I'll mention some of them. Just for example, we have the Azure IoT Hub, which is the ingestion tool of the information from devices to the cloud, and can also manage all those devices in scale. So which are some of the unique functionalities that you actually have within the Azure IoT Hub? You can have per device authentication, which basically means that you have one token per device, and that token or information is securely stored in a registry within the cloud that only your account is going to have access. So that's from the device perspective. I have many other services, such as machine learning, Azure Stream Analytics, Logic Apps, just to name a few. But then from a solution or IoT perspective, we also have the connection side of the solution. Then the Azure IoT Suite also helps in this piece because all the information actually being transmitted through X509 protocol, which our solution is fully compatible with. So you can be secure that the connection and the information is going to be transferred in a secure way to the cloud. But then in the cloud side, obviously that's where the Microsoft solution shines. We have a lot of features and functionalities here, not only to guarantee the solution is going to be safe and secure, such as Azure Active Directory, to control who is having access to all the information, but also advanced services such as machine learning, who can actually tell what's going to be the behavior, can predict patterns in the future, and also Azure Stream Analytics. So we do believe that the Azure IoT Suite is the right platform for enterprises in the B2B scenario to get started with IoT really quickly. And if you want to learn more, please check our website, internetofyourthings.com. You can also find more about the secure program in the same website. Hopefully you got excited and you're ready to get started with the Azure IoT Suite to really help transform your business. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go back to the moderator and we're going to have time for a Q&A.
Thank you so much for that presentation, gentlemen. That was fantastic. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and type your question into the Q&A window. We've had quite a good number of questions already, but if you have a burning question, please go ahead and type it into the window. And we're going to bring back on our two presenters and see how many questions they can get through in the next 10-15 minutes or so. Gentlemen, perhaps Ajman, do you want to go with the first question?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much. I'd like to say it was a great session. Thank you very much for coming and spending this time with us. I hope we have been able to answer some of your questions, but we have more. So what I'll do is I'll go over a few of those and try to put a few together so that I can answer more of those. The first question I like to really dig a little bit deeper is a question by one of our attendees, and the question really is, I have a bunch of different kinds of devices. There could be wearable devices, these could be chips in credit cards, and they're being used in point of sales devices. How do I evaluate these and how do I actually secure these? Or is there any one way of doing that? So the answer to that one question or a few questions with the same theme is that there is no one way of securing any of these devices or IoT deployments. You need to have a multi-layered approach here. You need to look at a bunch of different evaluation strategies, and of course you'll have to prioritize. Of course you'll have to see what are the most important ones, but we always recommend you to go high level first. For example, do an end-to-end threat model first, then pick up a few of those issues that come out of that threat modeling exercise, and then go in and start looking at, for example, what is the silicon that is on the device, so device analysis. What is the firmware or OS on that device, so do those kind of analyses. And so all of those different strategies of evaluation that you put in place and you execute is going to give you different kind of insights about your IoT deployments and the security of your IoT deployment. And all of those are valuable. And one thing to remember here is that the attack surface for IoT deployments is quite large as well as is very varied. It can be on the network, it can be physical, it can be on the silicon, OS, and so on. So you really have to have a multi-dimensional strategy over there. I hope I answered that one question. I'll go over to another question which has come up. Again, that's a theme in different 2 or 3 different questions. And the question really is, how do I identify my device on the network? What are the different strategies available to me when I am provisioning my device onto Azure IoT? And one of the big ones that you have that Azure IoT provides is a mutual authentication over the TLS channel. And this strategy, of course, assumes that you have a device which can have some kind of secure hardware and has a key on it, and then a certificate, which we recommend an X509 certificate, and then you can use that X509 certificate to authenticate to the cloud service. So this is one of the mechanisms we support, and this is an industry accepted support and a standard support for mutual authentication. So that's the second question. A few questions came up on that in that area. I'm now looking for more questions here.
Hi, Arjun. This is Leandro. Let me actually address one of the questions that we got from the audience. So one of the questions was around the support to secure firmware upgrade. If the Microsoft solution does support it, and the answer is actually yes. So one of the things that I mentioned into the Microsoft portfolio for IoT is called Azure IoT Hub, and it has one functionality called device management. With device management, you can actually update the firmware from the devices, which is basically you can push that update to the cloud. That's super important for customers, not only the customers with few devices, but more important for customers with thousands or millions of devices, and to make sure they have the latest firmware. Another question kind of related to this one around IoT Hub is IoT Hub a physical service? The service, how does it work? It actually is a cloud service, so it sits on top of the Microsoft Cloud platform, and it's the main ingestion tool in order to get the data from the devices to the Microsoft Cloud, so we can actually shine and help you provide insights from the data. Let me turn it back to Arjun for a couple more questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Leandro. I think one of the 2 or 3 questions that are coming in that direction is what is TPM, Trusted Platform Module, and how does that play in IoT? So TPM is just one of the standard ways of putting a trust anchor in your device. So essentially, it provides you with secure processing, secure storage, a secure element on your device. In addition to TPM, there are many other HSMs out there, and those HSMs provide similar functionality, though different manufacturers package it differently. But the basic functionality is the same. It provides you with a trust anchor on the device, and the trust anchor is usually a private key, which is stored very securely on the device, and nobody can get to it. You can only have a derivation of that key or a proof of possession of that key on the device. So TPM could be one of those ways of securing that key on the device, but there are other HSMs also out there, and they have different functionality. They have different price points. They also have different protocols that they support. So it is when you're thinking about the silicon design of your device, it is good to see what all is available out there and then select the best one. And also look at what kind of support that different hardware vendors provide in terms of keys already there or not there, and you have to do it. Is it self-generated, etc. So those are all the security questions you need to ask when you're thinking about a root of trust on your device. So there's another question which I'll take up, which is, I can answer this one, and then Leandro, you can jump on to the next one. Are there any best practices that you can suggest for devices such as IP cameras? I'll just reiterate over here, and the question specifically is these devices are deployed in the enterprise environment. And so obviously the bar to security and to the bar to making it secure is much higher, because there could be, of course, privacy concerns, IP protection, there could be personnel who are working there, whom you do not want their privacy to be compromised, as well as this is an IoT device which is pretty powerful, an IP camera, and you do not want it to be hit by a malware and be used as a bot in a larger bot network. So my answer to that is again a multi-dimensional evaluation of the device, which would give you, and you have to go from the very core, from the very bottom of the stack, which is look at the silicon, go all the way up to the firmware, operating system on the device, what are the open ports, what are the different drivers that are running on the device, how can I ensure that firmware updates happen securely, and then where does this camera connect to and how that connection is encrypted and so on, and what is the device identification and authentication on the device. Now, as I mentioned previously, this involves a lot of different kinds of evaluations, and that is what is almost like the theme of this webinar. You cannot do any one kind of evaluation to really get to the depth of, is this device really secure, and is it secure in an enterprise environment? You need to do, for example, end-to-end threat modeling. You probably need to do some physical device evaluation. You need to look at the firmware. You need to look at the deployment. Is it deployed securely? Can I update it securely? And again, the white paper that we have provided the link over here is going to walk you through that whole process so that you can see what that process means, and we have partners who can help you with evaluating your devices in which you are ready to deploy. And again, the link of those evaluators and how to reach them is also in that paper. Leandro, if you want, you can.
Yeah, sure. A couple more questions that we got here. So how do we know if a device is supported by Azure IoT? So basically, Microsoft has one program called Certify for IoT. If you guys go to azure.microsoft.com, you'll be able to actually check what is the latest and greatest devices who are actually fully compatible with Azure IoT. But let me tell you that what approach from our platform is open and flexible platform, which means it's able to connect to any kind of device, doesn't matter the OS, or even if it has an OS. If the device specifically in manufacturing scenarios doesn't have an OS, you can actually leverage a gateway, and Microsoft has a solution called Gate SDK to really help that connection add the intelligence in the network to make sure it's connected in a secure way. Let me see, there's another questions around if Microsoft has any recommendation for security checklist so customers can actually use. So I'll reiterate one of the things that Arjun mentioned. So actually we have a new white paper that can give a little bit more details about that. If you guys check the URL that we provided towards the end of the webinar on the calls to action, you'll be able to actually have access to the white paper, and there are going to be some examples of methodologies, how to do checklists, threat modeling, the stride model as well, just to make sure that your solution is secure. Yeah. Let me go back to Arjun.
Yeah. And also, Leandro, I'll just add to that. This is a very interesting question, and we have been hearing this concern from our customers quite a lot. Essentially, you are thinking about deploying your IoT infrastructure, and now you are in the process of selecting the right device, selecting the right software which will sit on these devices, and then all of these devices will be talking to each other. In addition to the evaluation that we are talking about, there is also a set of best practices. And I just pushed out a URL to those best practices you'll be able to see in your chat window. This really is our realization that no one partner or no one role or person in this whole IoT infrastructure deployment can actually secure the whole end-to-end infrastructure. Now, what does that mean? That means that a different entity is actually developing the silicon. Similarly, a very different entity is deploying it. A different company probably is providing you the software which will go on top of these devices or the cloud. And then maybe you're getting it deployed by somebody else. So there are all these different roles, different people who are involved in making these IoT deployments real. And so what we realized is that we need to have a holistic view of who does what, and almost like best practices. So the URL that I just posted takes you to that best practice. It talks about what IoT hardware manufacturers need to think of, what solution developers need to think of, what solution deployers need to think of, and what operators need to think of. So our goal here is that the whole infrastructure, whoever is involved in this infrastructure should be thinking about what they provide, what value they provide to the IoT infrastructure end to end, and so each person can look at it differently. I'll give you a few examples here. For example, if you are thinking about adopting a certain piece of hardware for your IoT infrastructure, the device manufacturer, the hardware manufacturer, needs to think about things like what are the minimum hardware requirements that need to go onto the device. I'll give you an example here. If your device has a USB port, which is not required for its operations, we recommend it not be there, because USB ports are an attack vector which can be exploited a lot. Similarly, if you are building hardware, we recommend that it should have a secure hardware on it, an HSM on it, so that you can put your private key and assert on it. So these are some of the best practices we have for hardware manufacturers. Similarly, for developers who are developing your solutions, if you are integrating different solutions together, be it open source or not, you need to think about a few things. Again, we have some best practices there. When you're deploying, we again have some best practices. And then if you are an operator, you need to think about things like how frequently do I audit my access control logs, as an example. How do I physically protect my IoT infrastructure, and so on. So all of these best practices are out there. We have been working with our customers and with our partners to understand what that means. And what we need to do is we want to provide this information to all of you or whoever is deploying IoT infrastructure to have more secure IoT deployments. I hope that answered that one question about what do I do holistically when I'm selecting my devices and my IoT infrastructure components. Okay, so I think there are a few more questions. Let me just, I'm scrolling through them and trying to see what are the themes there. So the one question that I see which is important is Azure IoT program for non-profit. Leandro, do you want to talk to that? I think there are different SKUs that we provide, and there is a SKU which you could use free. So Leandro, can you talk to that?
Yeah, sure. Yes, that's a good question. So the Azure IoT Hub, which is the main ingestion tool from Microsoft, has 4 versions of it. The S1, S2, and S3 plans, and basically the difference is in terms of number of a message that you can send. But we also have a free tier, so anybody who wants to get started can do that. Another option for nonprofits, if you go to the azure.microsoft.com portal, there's a link where you can actually get, I believe, I'm not sure the amount, but it's depending on the country, there is a specific amount of Azure credits that you can get just to test the solution from Microsoft as well. So that will be my 2 recommendations. One, use the free tier of the Azure IoT Hub, and the second one would check the azure.microsoft.com portal and sign up, and you can get Azure credits as well, so you can test. There's another question here related to IoT operational system version as well, if we have something. The answer is yes. Basically, we have one Windows IoT Core, which is an operational system for IoT devices that works really well with our cloud platform, which then is the Azure IoT. So both those solutions, they kind of have a better together, and from a security perspective, they're fully compatible as well. So the answer to the question is yes, Microsoft does have an OS service as well, the Windows IoT Core, for IoT devices. Yeah.
Yeah, and Leandro, I'll just add to that previous question about how Azure IoT is available and perhaps for non-for-profit. In addition to IoT Hub as a service, we also provide device SDKs. Essentially, any client which needs to connect to IoT Hub needs to do it securely. And to do that, we provide a set of client-side libraries in different languages for different platforms. And on that client side, we are totally cross-platform. So we provide libraries in C, Java, Node.js, Python. And our goal is that if you have any device which has operating systems such as Linux or Android or Windows or whatever, you should be able to actually have a library sitting there which connects your device up to the cloud securely. And these libraries are all open sourced, and we do not charge anything for those. Those are all open sourced on GitHub, and so you can simply download those, and since they are source code, you can actually see what's going on there, and you can also add to that, change it the way you feel like. So that's our connectivity to the cloud. The second thing we provide is a gateway SDK. This gateway SDK is again cross-platform, so it is Windows and Linux. It's also an SDK. So it's a bunch of libraries and a development environment where you can actually develop your own gateway to deploy. And the goal there is if you have devices which either do not talk IP, or you don't want them to go on to public networks. These devices, for example, Bluetooth or Z-Wave devices, then connect to the gateway, which is deployed on a higher power machine on your premises. And then from there on, the gateway provides you with secure connectivity to IoT Hub. And now this gateway, again, cross-platform, Windows and Linux, is also open sourced. So on GitHub. So you can go to GitHub, get that open source SDK, and you can play around with it as much as you want. And our goal is to enable as many devices and all these different scenarios where devices might talk IP, might not talk IP, and so on, to be able to connect to Azure IoT easily and securely. So those are also some of the things that we offer. They're free of charge. You can simply use them. They're open source. They're on GitHub. They're community driven. So I think that's a great way to interact with IoT Hub. So I think I'll pass back to Leandro. Anything that you would like to add there, Leandro?
No, I think that was a very good explanation. I'm monitoring the IAM window here as well. So I think we are able to cover all the questions from the audience. So I'll turn it back to the moderator, but we are going to be still available on IAM window. So if you guys have more questions to type, we can definitely answer. But I'll turn it back to the moderator now. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you to both of you for answering so many of those questions. We did get through most of them. If you still have any questions that you'd like to add into the chat window, we'll probably stay online for another 5 or 10 minutes, and we can answer those through the chat window. So once again, thank you, gentlemen, for both presenting as well as answering all those questions. We'd just like to finish off today with a couple poll questions. And the first poll question that we'd like to have is, how useful did you find this webinar? And your answer choices are perhaps not very useful, somewhat useful, useful, or very useful. And of course, it's extremely useful for us to know how you felt about the webinar. And the final poll question for the day, and this is your chance to let us know if there's something else that you would like to learn. So go ahead and type your response in here, and just let us know if there's anything that perhaps you were hoping that we would cover today that we did not get a chance to cover, or something specific. Just let us know. We'll give you a good 20 or 30 seconds to respond to this one here. Okay, everyone. So if you'd like to finish up typing your answer there, and please hit submit when you're done. So thank you once again for attending today. As a reminder, you will receive a link to the recorded session. This does conclude our session for today. We'll stay on the line. We'll go on mute now. We'll stay on the line just in case you have any other questions through the chat window. We'll be available for another 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you once again for joining us.